Welcome to today's video, Mastering Skeletal Formulae with Miss G. Good afternoon everybody. So today's video is having a think about skeletal formulae, and skeletal formulae is something that you first meet during the A-level course. Up until this point you are used to using a range of different formulae, including displayed, structural, molecular, empirical and general formulae, to represent different organic compounds. And at A-level we introduce skeletal formula as a new form of structural formula, which gives us an idea as to what the compound will look like. Now what we need to understand is how I have been able to, in this image, go from the displayed formula for 1-chlorobutene, of which I have drawn in the skeletal formula the E version of that, and how I have then converted that displayed formula into the skeletal formula I have shown underneath. So there are a series of rules that we follow when we draw skeletal formulae that take a little bit of getting used to. And what I hope to do in this video is outline what those rules are and then go through some examples of how we can convert between displayed and structural formulae into skeletal formulae, and how we might go about naming compounds from skeletal formulae as well. So we're going to start with, how do I go from displayed to skeletal? So there aren't actually that many rules, but the rules are obviously really important in helping us to know how to draw skeletal formulae. And the first rule is the most important. We do not show any carbon atoms in a skeletal formulae. What we do is we draw lines in a zigzag arrangement to show a chain of carbon atoms, and every end and every bend in that zigzag chain then represents a carbon atom. So we can't just draw one straight line like we might do with displayed formula and break it up with the C's for the carbon atoms, because that's not going to show us how many carbon atoms there are. So we go with a zigzag arrangement to show the length of carbon chain, where every end of that line and every bend within that zigzag chain represents a carbon atom. The other thing we don't show on a skeletal formula is all of the hydrogens. So no hydrogens are drawn bonded to carbon atoms. The only time we would draw hydrogen atoms is if they are bonded to anything else, like an oxygen or a nitrogen or any other atom. But if you have hydrogen atoms bonded to carbon atoms, they are not drawn. And we make the assumption that the carbon atoms will always be forming the maximum number of covalent bonds which they can, which is 4. All other atoms are then drawn as normal. So halogens would be drawn as normal, oxygen would be drawn as normal, nitrogen would be drawn as normal, and so on and so forth. So those are the 4 key rules of skeletal formulae. So let's see how I applied those 4 rules to the example overleaf. So from my displayed formula, I could see that I had 4 carbon atoms in my chain. I can see that there is a carbon-carbon double bond between the middle 2 carbons, and then on the end carbon on the right hand side I have a chlorine atom, and I named this 1-chlorobutene. Now in order to turn that into skeletal, the first thing I need to know are how many carbon atoms are in my longest chain. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that then dictates the length of the zigzag line that I draw. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now this is the biggest mistake that students tend to make, because as soon as you put your pen on the paper to start your zigzag line, you are already drawing carbon number 1, because that's then going to be the end of the chain. So once you have drawn your 4 carbon atoms, it's always worth just checking that you definitely only have 4 and you haven't accidentally drawn 5 or 6, which is very easy to do and a very common mistake that I see. So the end and every bend represent carbons. Then on the end carbon I've put the chlorine. Now what some students also think is that the end of that line represents a carbon, and it doesn't, because I have positioned the halogen atom there. Had I have not drawn the Cl, yes, that would have been another carbon in my chain, but I've put the Cl on there, so that is that bond between the end carbon at this bend and the chlorine there. To show the double bond, I've done exactly like I would in a displayed formula, and rather than having one line between my 2 points, I've put 2 lines to represent the double bond. So this is carbon 1, 2, 3, 4, or as you would name it, carbon 1, 2, 3, 4. There's my double bond, and there's my halogen, and that needs to be shown because that is not a hydrogen atom. So that is drawn as normal. There are no carbons. I haven't drawn my 3 hydrogens on here. I haven't drawn my hydrogen on there. I haven't drawn my hydrogen on there. And I haven't drawn my 2 hydrogens on there, because all of those hydrogens are bonded to carbon atoms and they are all omitted. So the idea with skeletal is it's meant to be a bit simpler than displayed, but it does take a little bit of getting your head around. So let's have a look at some more examples. Okay, so let's try apply the rules of drawing skeletal formula to these 2 examples here. So I've got one compound that I've drawn using displayed formula and the other that I have drawn using structural. Now my advice for the second example, anytime you are given structural formula and you are asked to convert it into skeletal, would be to go via displayed formula first, particularly whilst you're still learning. So if in doubt, draw it out. And that applies to many different things. If you've got a name, if in doubt, draw it out would be my advice. With the top one, we've already got it in displayed formula. So now we need to think about how do I convert that into skeletal. So we're not going to show any of the carbon atoms, but we're going to have to draw a zigzag chain of carbon where every end and every bend represents a carbon. So my longest chain is 3. So my zigzag is going to just be like a chevron. And then I've got this methyl group as well. So I'm going to have to draw a line coming out of the middle carbon, but again there won't then be anything at the end of that line because at every end and every bend we know there is a carbon. And I'm not going to show any of these 9 hydrogens on there, but I am going to have to show the bromine coming off of the second carbon, because we don't show hydrogen atoms that are bonded to carbons, but we do show every other atom as normal. So let me convert that into a skeletal formula and then I can check back that we're all happy with that. So that is what my skeletal formula would look like. So at the end, carbon 1, bend, carbon 2, end, carbon 3. That represents my longest chain within this compound. The stick then coming off the middle carbon represents the methyl, because at the end of that line is a carbon with the maximum number of hydrogens on there. And then also coming off of the second carbon is the bromine. So also off the middle carbon in my zigzag, I've shown my bromine atom. So that would be how I would convert between this displayed formula into this skeletal formula here. Now, as I said, for this structural formula, you may be best drawing it out as displayed first, which I will do using sticks underneath in a second. But it's not necessarily essential that you do that, because you can still work out how many carbons you have. 1, 2, 3, 4. So I need to make sure that my zigzag would go down, up, to give me my 4 carbons. Then I'm going to have to put the O and the H on the left-hand end, because anything that isn't a hydrogen bonded to a carbon is shown. So the O bonded to the carbon, and the hydrogen will be shown bonded to the oxygen, because all hydrogens that are not bonded to carbon are shown. None of the other hydrogens will be shown. There is a double bond in here because these carbons have only got 1 hydrogen on them, and then the end carbon we would assume had all of its hydrogens on there. So we don't need to draw it as displayed first if you don't have to, but if in doubt, draw it out. So I'll do that, convert it into my skeletal, and come back and show you what I've done. And there we have it. So underneath the structural formula, I drew out a very quick stick displayed formula. And from there, I just think it might be easier whilst you're still learning how to do skeletal formula to then construct this. So we've got our longest carbon chain of 4, 1 at that bend, 2 at that bend, 3 at that bend, 4 at that end. And then coming from the first carbon, I've got my O and my H, and I have to show both of those atoms according with my rules. And then I've got my double bond between carbons 2 and 3, so that's why we've got the double line in there. Okay, Let's go on to having a look at some examples where we're going to have a try at naming some compounds from skeletal formulae. And I've tried to include some different homologous series here. And at the top you can see that I've got a cyclical compound. And whenever we draw cyclical compounds in skeletal formulae, they end up looking like shapes. So the hexagon in the top example represents 6 carbon atoms joined into a ring. So that would represent cyclohexane because there are 6 carbons. And then coming from one of the carbons, I have got an iodine. And what we are assuming is that from all of the other carbons, there will be 2 hydrogen atoms, and there will also be a hydrogen atom from the carbon with the iodine also. Now, if we only have one substituent group on a cyclical compound, we don't need to give that atom a number within the name, because if we put the iodine on any of those carbons, the compounds would all be the same thing because they wouldn't be any different from each other, because we could just rotate the molecule and it would be the same thing. So for the top example there, I'm going to call that iodocyclohexane. For the second example, first thing I'm going to do is count my longest chain of carbons, so every end and every bend, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So my longest chain name is going to be based on pent. I've then got a double bond coming from the middle carbon, carbon number 3, to an oxygen. And when we have a C double bond O in the middle of our chain, that represents a ketone. So we've got pentanone, but I also need to specify where the C double bond is, because it could be on that carbon or that carbon, and that would be different from where I've positioned the C double bond O here. So this would be pentan-3-one. And then in the bottom example, we've got a few more atoms than we've seen on some of the other examples I've chosen so far. So we've got an end and a bend, and then we've got our carbon double bonded to our oxygen, and then coming from that carbon, we have an NH2. All atoms that are not carbons are drawn, except hydrogens obviously that are bonded to carbon, but these hydrogens are not bonded to the carbon, they're bonded to the nitrogen, which is why they are then shown. So we haven't drawn the carbon there, and we haven't drawn the CH3 on the end, but that's actually all we have omitted here in this particular example. So my longest chain is 1, 2. And when I have an NH2, which is an amine group, next to a C double bond O, this becomes an amide. That is the functional group for an amide, a C double bond O adjacent to an NH2. So because we have 2 carbons and the amide group, that would then be ethanamide. I really hope it's been helpful to see a few different examples. So going from having the skeletal formulae to naming them, starting with either displayed or structural formula, and then drawing them as skeletal, and just to go through what the rules of drawing skeletal formulae are. If you know those, then practice will make progress. And if anybody has any questions, please do feel free to comment on the video or reach out to me on any social media platform or via email. Wishing you all a really lovely day and the rest of your week. Take care, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found it helpful.